Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having us. We met some of you this morning, and thank you, especially to Barat for doing all the legwork. And we are incredibly excited to be here over the next couple of days. So yes, we are COMMONStudio, and we are a collaborative creative practice that mainly consists of myself and my partner Daniel. So between the two of us, we have background, as Rob mentioned, in product design, studio art, landscape architecture, and urban ecology. And this situates our practice somewhere in a kind of a blurry space between art and design, and more recently, environmental science. So we often collaborate across a variety of disciplines, and we engage with different practitioners and communities all over the place. So at the heart of our practice, and the namesake of our studio, is the commons. And we want to unpack this idea a little bit so that it really helps situate our work and the types of spaces and projects we pursue. So we're evoking the commons in two very crucial ways. The first is referring to that which is shared. So this includes actual spaces and places, as well as the aspects of our daily life that we collectively partake in and actively shape through our intentions or at times unintentionally. So as a result of these shared spaces and places, they're often highly disturbed, highly complex, and at times contested. So examples of this can range from a public park to, I imagine, all the shared things in your studio, like a studio refrigerator. The second sense of the commons is that which is ordinary. So this connotes the banal, the easily overlooked, and things that are usually they have a dismissive or a negative undertone. So for an example, a weed in a sidewalk crack. So our work plays with both of these notions, the shared and the ordinary, as a foundation for a series of collaborative, what we call social, ecological, and spatial practices. And we have the aim of both understanding and creatively shaping the urban ecosystem from the bottom up. So we do a lot of different types of projects. Typically, they fall into one of these three categories. The first is an installation, something that is immersive, usually experiential, that explores these different ideas and phenomena. Of course, we have interventions, which are very site-specific projects that are at times either sanctioned or unsanctioned, and they're actively engaging with the site itself. And of course, initiatives. These are long-term, sprawling, transdisciplinary projects that involve many partners and many sites.
So tonight we're going to talk through three recent projects, all of which are based in Bangalore, India. And so we're drawn to these types of spaces, places like Bangalore, because they are full of complexity, because they're full of messiness and contradiction. And anyone who is interested in, as we are, issues of urban ecology would do well to pay very close attention to what is happening within the megacities of South Asia. So Bangalore is actually India's fourth largest megacity. It has been and will remain one of the fastest growing cities in the world, and fueled by one of the fastest growing urban economies the world has ever seen. So it's a very fascinating place to work. We have been working there off and on for the last several years. Already a city of over 13 million inhabitants, well on its way to becoming, so that basically qualifies it as megacity status, right, over 10 million inhabitants. Well on its way to hypercity status, which would be over 20 million inhabitants in the coming decades. And so what you're seeing here in red is depicting the approximately 1,000% increase in impervious surfaces over the last 4 or so years, which is really astonishing to think about. But as we'll see, it's not all a narrative of tragedy and loss, as this might imply, right? So often we think about the kind of creep of urbanization as a narrative of loss. But it's not that. Bangalore has a deep history, it has a vibrant present, but just as with any megacity, it has somewhat of an uncertain future. So that's what we're hoping to kind of explore here tonight.
And so, as a first kind of introduction to this idea of place and its many contradictions and the way that we're talking about, we're going to share a short film that we recently made. We don't want to say much about it in the hopes that you can just kind of open up your senses and try and kind of keep an open mind.
Can we, is it possible to maybe then let's slightly more? It's about 12 minutes or so.
right. We hope everyone's still awake. Okay. So we're going to move right into the second project, which is called the Super Reach It Pile Study. And this project was also situated in the periphery of Bangalore, and is an example of a small-scale socio-ecological spatial intervention. So as you can start to see from some of the shots of the streetscape itself, as a pedestrian, Bangalore can be a little overwhelming to the senses. It's incredibly exciting, but also sometimes a little chaotic, and in certain places, absolute cacophony. So one of the ways of coping with this is using Google Earth as a strategy to kind of navigate, to get a different perspective of the city. So this, you're allowed to kind of have more of a bird's eye view, and just kind of orient yourself. So through this process, we found this particular site, which was very close to where we worked and lived, and we were very confused by this. We were basically like, what the hell is this?
You see that like Google Earth actually locates an apartment complex in the middle of this space, the Dream Super Reach It apartment complex that actually does not exist. Right? So it's this like specter of a future development scenario or someone's sort of dashed plans from the past. These are the types of weird anomalies that start to pique our interest.
And so while Google Earth was of course helpful in finding the location, it was really not helpful in making sense of it. And so for that we had to go to the site itself, and this is what we found. So this is basically a very large landscape of displaced rubble piles that just stretch out as far as the eye can see. And each pile consisted of various different materials, different types of soils, different colors, different textures, different consistencies. As you can see, it ranged from like very rich topsoils to bleached sand. And what we learned is that these types of territories were really rare in the city. They're actually a byproduct of a large-scale excavation that's connected to this local boom in construction projects, particularly high-rise apartments around lakes, the lakes in the city. And so these piles are displaced earth that is illicitly dumped by these developers, usually in the middle of the night when no one can say anything. So at Super Reach It, this site was slowly but surely being encroached upon on the edges of this lake, what was a former lake bed, and was unfortunately filling in a historic wetland. So it was very easy to, maybe make some judgments about what was going on, but we tried to caution that. We didn't really want to judge or blame or diagnose, but to take our time to observe and understand what was happening. So we spent a lot of time there. And what we started to observe is how the site operated as an informal urban commons that was still heavily used by various different communities who surround the site and use it for a range of needs and activities. So socially and spatially, this lake is a much valued resource. The perimeter is used as a thoroughfare going through the piles lead to the lake for bathing and laundry, and local herdsmen graze sheep and cows and goats, all sorts of things. This was also a common area to congregate and socialize. You could frequently hear laughter, find playing cards randomly, and ecologically, we considered this a novel ecosystem that was responding to these disturbances and hosting a range of spontaneously occurring plants and animals, including urban cobras. And this vegetation was slowly subsuming these piles and transitioning the site to a new type of ecology. So basically, this is an incredibly complex and evolving place, somewhere between a wasteland, a wetland, a place, or a non-place. Yet overwhelmingly, it was perceived as a wasteland. And that was pretty unshakable in the community who lived and worked around it. And it had a devalued status that extended to the human community that also used it every day. So this is Ramesh, one of the members of the community. He's a local Haisuka or cowboy who we met as he grazed his cattle there. He was incredibly excited to meet us, and we were incredibly excited to meet him. And he was kind enough to help us collect our plant specimens and give us a tour of the site. So again, what do you do? What is the potential for creative collaboration in a site like this? What is appropriate? And so, these were the questions we started to ask ourselves, and some of the considerations that we had as going through this process were, one was to accept the transitional status of the space as temporary. It's on its way to becoming another type of landscape, one that we can't really predict. We also need to accept our role as outsider. We're visitors passing through, and we need to respect existing norms. And the third, of course, is that we have absolutely no budget, but a very strong desire to recognize the value of this space. So there are a lot of opportunities within these kind of considerations, right? How to resist this negative public perception of the site. It did not really align with what we observed, and to fight this wasteland narrative, and how to stage a single explicit gesture of recognition and value that could align with local norms. So in this case, we decided to embrace a tactical botanical ally, specifically the marigold, and it was chosen for its particular cultural, ecological, and spatial potential. So in Hindu cultures, marigolds are associated with the sacred aspects of everyday life. They attract auspicious energy, and they mark all types of structures. So you see them, you encounter them every day casually. Ecologically, it's a pioneer species that has the potential to add ecological potential through rapid life cycle, since it's an annual plant. It produces biomass, it attracts pollinators, and increases biodiversity. Spatially, its visual qualities are that they're very fast growing, they're vibrant flowers, and they're very easy to trace and track over time. And of course, they're very cheap. We could find them just about anywhere, and for $50, you could like 30 kilos. We got a lot of them. So we focused on a single pile near a very close to an existing pedestrian thoroughfare that was heavily trafficked, and we focused on the potential for seeding an ecological process that would slowly unfold and expand over time. So, the grand idea was to originally complete the intervention anonymously. So we got up at 2 in the morning and went in the dead of night. And as I'm sure everyone in the room knows, nothing goes according to plan. It takes 3 million times longer than you anticipate. And so, of course, we're toiling and tired, and the sun comes up, and we're spotted. And so before we could really finish, we were slowly joined by about a dozen folks from the surrounding communities who were up early, going around about their daily, routine, and obviously noticed us. They approached us very slowly, every time we looked up, they were kind of slowly coming towards us. And unfortunately, we don't share a common language. We couldn't just have a clear conversation that explained everything. But they understood what we were doing, and they were lovely about it. And they just picked up flowers and slowly started helping us. They took photos, they shook our hands, and they ultimately invited us to breakfast. It was a really lovely and unexpected part of the project. This is the final outcome. And so this is about 6 to 8 weeks later, and after the initial flowers faded, each marigold then became its own seed bank, hopefully giving rise to this next generation. So we're hoping, right, like the ultimate goal is that this is a reoccurring spectacle of value that will repeat and spread without us. And so, we hope to return and track these traces over time, and kind of hope that this is like a proof of concept for maybe a larger intervention at a similar site.
Okay, so going deeper into the Indian context, the last project we're going to share tonight is what we refer to as strains, or in-stream or strategic in-stream systems. It is a project that we began in 2016 with partial support from the US Fulbright program, which basically just allowed us to relocate to Bangalore for a year of immersion that we've since extended into a longer time period. In fact, we spent most of the summer there, and we just arrived back in the US. So it's an example in our practice of a long-term initiative in which collaboration occurs across many disciplinary, and in this case, across cultural boundaries. And so what you're seeing below is some of the local partner organizations we've been honored to work with over the last few years and build relationships with. And we urge you to jot down their names and look them up if you have time, or if you feel so inclined. They're all wonderful. We acted as the kind of design instigators in this case, but the work itself is very much built in collaboration with our Indian colleagues. And it's really starting to get to the heart of what we're exploring with all of you in the next few days, and that is these deeper issues of urban hydrology. Bangalore is a city of lakes, and that is actually rare among major population centers. The city isn't intersected by any sort of perennial water source, such as a major river. Instead, surface water flows through a system of over 200 man-made lakes interconnected by a network of open surface channels. So it's through these channels, referred to locally as nalas, urban runoff and wastewater flows and basically follows the natural sloping terrain of the landscape. So you can sort of imagine here water flowing through these lakes, flowing through these nalas as it makes its way through the city. So it's a great example of a highly complex social, ecological, infrastructural system. And historically, these infrastructures were used effectively for stormwater storage, agricultural irrigation, yet the recent explosion of largely unregulated urban development in the last couple of decades especially has put huge pressure on these infrastructures. So they're now receiving a lot more wastewater than they used to, including a daily deluge of domestic wastewater, urban stormwater, and in some cases, industrial effluents. So this contamination, all the contamination that is contained in that water, hyperaccumulates as it makes its way through the system, as you can imagine. And this causes a range of local impacts to ecosystems, to livelihoods, to public health. And this includes water bodies which infamously catch on fire on a regular basis. So this is Bellinger Lake, the city's largest water body, on fire. You also have these toxic foam events. So this is an example of this caustic foam that just kind of bubbles over, takes over the city, melts paint off cars, wreaks havoc. Not fun. But you also have all the typical things that you would have in a highly contaminated urban watershed. You have fish kills, you have downstream impacts on health and food systems, etc. And so, the planned response to this wicked challenge is somewhat typical for a city bureaucracy staffed by engineers. And that is, let's build large-scale, monofunctional end-of-pipe infrastructures such as wastewater treatment plants. These are absolutely necessary. They're a part of the puzzle that cannot be ignored, but they tend to require huge investments to implement, to maintain. And so in a city where widespread power cuts, for example, are the norm, and huge inadequate or kind of funding gaps that lead to inadequate investment and maintenance of existing infrastructures, when those conditions are the norm, it really leads to these huge capacity gaps. So there's a huge capacity gap for treatment in the city that will almost certainly continue into the future. And so the question we're asking is really what other immediate stopgap responses might be explored to kind of supplement these top-down strategies in the meantime. And our approach has been to explore what impact might be possible by means of decentralized, low-cost, small-scale, tactical interventions within the open stormwater channels themselves. Can we achieve some supplemental or partial decontamination within these arteries? What you're seeing here is a typical channelized null condition. Should be easy enough to fix, right? We obviously have our work cut out for us, but we really believe this space, currently conceptualized as a drain, as a waste stream, as an elsewhere, represents a huge underexplored ecological opportunity. So what you're seeing here is a schematic design for such an intervention within these types of spaces. So it's really about disrupting the dry weather flows of urban wastewater, treating them partially in stream. So it's comprised of these various stages for diverting, capturing solid waste, which is a huge issue within these channels, increasing retention time to settle out suspended silts, a biofiltration zone that's kind of treating water in a very low-tech way through aggregate materials. And then you have tree pits along the Nala edge that actively involve trees in the phytoremediation process. And so the in-stream features are very modular, can be installed on a seasonal basis, minimum cost, and really the goal is lowering levels of solid waste and contamination to levels that are more acceptable before they reach the larger water bodies downstream, right? Before they reach these receiving waters. And so this is a really great quote from Anne Spurn. I think it's the heart of what we're trying to accomplish, And what she says is incremental change through small projects is often more manageable, more feasible, less daunting, and more adaptable to local needs. And she goes on to say that solutions need to be comprehensive, but that the understanding of the problem must be. And so, like with many of the projects that we've explored in the past, Strains really proposes a mode of urban acupuncture. And as such, we know that a single intervention isn't going to cut it, right? We know that, a single intervention is not going to cut it, but what if we deployed a dozen or 100 of these things in the right places at the right times and at the right scales throughout an entire watershed? Could that have a real impact? That's really one of the core questions we're asking. And so we're trying to use this project as an opportunity to bridge various scales, from site to city, and really kind of build a compelling case for bottom-up design in a more rigorous way. And by this we really mean we're using this design to frame a series of discrete and actionable research questions. So Strains really has a lot of moving parts, a lot of mini projects within it, and they fall into two different categories. One is design experiments, and two, I think the other is what we refer to as envisioning processes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those look like, but the basic idea is that we're really trying to learn from small tactical site scales to inform larger citywide strategic scales. So we're trying to create a feedback loop between site and city, between experimentation and application. And so this is an example of what we're calling design experiment, a lab-based study that we recently published in Water Science and Technology. Here we're trying to understand the potential of using readily available local building materials as inexpensive biofilters in the design. So we pumped synthetic wastewater through a variety of aggregate materials, terracotta, gravel, cinder, to test their decontamination performance and capacity. So it gave us an actual design insight. It actually showed us that terracotta rubble, which is available in abundance in the city, is capable of forming stable biofilms that aid in the breakdown of organic contaminants in urban wastewater. Based on the success of that small-scale lab-based study, we're building a larger, longer-term field-based study using actual urban wastewater. So this is now underway. This is kind of what we were overseeing this summer. And this will help us further demonstrate the viability of these materials for future interventions. So lab conditions can be very stable, but we're really trying to understand with this one, how might these systems handle the unpredictable conditions out there in the world. And so we're also going to be introducing some plants into these as well. So it's a sort of horizontal constructed wetland system that is one piece of that larger design that we're kind of testing. We're also doing physical as well as virtual hydrological modeling to determine effective modes of solid waste diversion, assessing overflow risk, assessing minimum capacity, etc. Okay, so if the design experiments give us the what and the how, it's the envisioning process that gives us, or it's trying to answer the question of where. So where can these tactics be most effectively deployed at the scale of the entire watershed? And so what you're seeing here is actually the final output of such a study. So basically a citywide suitability analysis, very similar to what we are going to be exploring tomorrow with all of you. And so we felt because that's most relevant to that, we might spend a few minutes describing it in more detail. And it's okay if it doesn't make entire sense right now. I think it'll be much more clear tomorrow. So it starts with a basic research question, right? Which knolls and lake chains are most suitable for strains interventions? And then defining what suitability means in this case. So in this case, it meant areas of low encroachment, areas where domestic gray water was the norm rather than industrial dumping, areas where that were currently underserved by existing wastewater treatment plants, hardcore areas where they could potentially benefit from supplemental kind of green space, and accessible to existing roads for maintenance. So these are our assumptions. Then we need to make the process sort of spatially explicit using GIS data. So, for example, I'm just going to show you two of those layers. If we feel that these, so on the left, you're looking at park proximity, so the idea of this layer is that we feel these interventions can provide some sort of supplemental green space within park-poor communities. We can set up this layer that considers the sort of spatial distribution of all the existing parks in the city. So that's what you're seeing on the left. In terms of park proximity, the greater the distance from the nearest park, the higher the suitability for these types of interventions. Right? So what you're seeing here are buffer zones. Higher suitability buffer zones are shown in green, lower in red. On the other hand, if we consider lake proximity, which is the map on the right, we want to prioritize areas closer to existing lakes. So we create buffer zones around them. The closer green areas being more suitable for in-stream interventions, the further away being less suitable. I hope that makes sense. It's a lot, I know. So beyond just these two layers, we actually had 10 different GIS layers in this analysis. So they're ranging from the road network to census data about household wastewater dumping to data about industrial sites and industrial dumping into waterways. So all of these are made spatially explicit and rated according to our original kind of suitability assumptions. And then we go through a weighting process. So all the data layers that are deemed to be more important are given higher percentage of influence in the kind of final analysis. And so what we're essentially doing is padding up all the suitability across this kind of suitability scores across these individual layers to form a final composite. And it looks something like this. So it's this composite of all the landscape criteria clipped to the particular geometry of the knolls themselves. And this starts to, I guess the question is like, so who cares? Why does this matter? For us, it becomes a really useful tool to identify potential pilot sites or pilot regions for testing local interventions. So for example, according to this analysis, we're really able to map each lake chain according to its suitability score. So what you see here is one of those lake chains, the Yellow Chetty Lake chain, which it has the highest suitability score according to this analysis. So this really allowed us to target this area, this specific lake chain, for these kind of phase 1 pilot projects, so that we're using to test the concept on a local scale. So we've since been in contact with local decision makers and within this specific region, and we actually have been able to propose local demonstration sites, such as this one, which is at the eastern knoll of a lake called Jakur Lake. And so this is a more detailed view of that proposal, just showing how the envisioning process then becomes site-specific. So it's site-specific, but it's also informed by this larger strategy. So it shows how these systems become incorporated into the particular streetscape of a specific neighborhood as a kind of visible entity. So as this site was actually in close proximity to a new apartment complex that's currently under construction, the design proposed the addition of a kind of public promenade which connects residents to the nearby lake. And so we really imagine strings as a new typology of green infrastructure. That's actually what we call a provisional green infrastructure, or PGI, that responds to the unique constraints and opportunities posed by the megacity, all of which require a much more frugal, much more flexible design, and a more inclusive means of implementation and maintenance. The ultimate vision for strains is to kind of engender a shift in perception, a shift in management practices, from that of a drain to that really sort of engendering a shift from conceiving of these spaces as a drain to conceiving of these spaces as the ecosystems that they are. And so we really feel like by starting small, we can create these feedback loops that create these new perceptions, these new behaviors, these new legacies of stewardship to develop over time. Okay, so that's all we have for you today. We hope we convinced you that there's maybe more meat that meets the eye within the urban ecosystem. And we thank you so much for all of the wonderful work we've seen today, and for your attention, and for what we know is going to be a great few days.
Some questions and answers if you'd like.
one question I had was, what made you go towards South Asia and specifically India and or specifically Bangalore? Because yeah, what was how did you turn to that place?
Thank you. Okay. So we were in Southern California for a very long time, which is actually a very new city. And we had the gift to be able to go to Europe, which was quite a bit older. But Asia really represents like what's happening now and the future, which are incredibly large urban cities growing at rapid paces that just are unprecedented anywhere else in the world. And we just felt like we needed to go. There was so much to learn from that. And Bangalore, from everything that we were learning in Bangalore and some of the people who, we went there for a lot of reasons, but one of them was some of the people that were there. So Harini Nagendra is a researcher, she just moved to universities, who is studying socio-ecological many things, but mostly urban street trees in Bangalore. And she was incredibly influential in getting us over there and getting us situated within the city. And we have received a very warm welcome, and which has really facilitated the project continuing and going back over and over again.
Show of hands, how many people have been to India? Oh, okay. You know, for all of you who have not been to India and are maybe reticent for one reason or another, don't be nervous. Don't let it scare you. Don't let mega cities scare you, right? You see the headlines, you see the sort of dire predictions, etc. That is a footnote in the larger, vibrant kind of present moment in these cities and in these regions. And for us, yeah, what really was an interest in the future of urbanization and a desire to really kind of see that firsthand.
Thank you for speaking tonight. I wanted to talk about this specific project with the chemicals. A lot of your projects address these like ecological and social concerns in the area, and that's what you're motivated by. You talked a little bit about wanting to anonymously install this in this area. What was the motivation behind that? Prompted you to sort of do this anonymously?
Once again, we have to give you a little context. So some of our earlier projects were incredibly socially motivated. We worked very deeply with communities for years before we developed projects. And to be honest, like they were wonderful, but they're incredibly time and resource intensive. And when we were in Bangalore, this was one of a couple projects we were working on. We didn't really have the resources or the language abilities to communicate as thoroughly as we would have liked. And so we were really relying on observation and like our good judgment, which, you know, you can get things wrong. And so we wanted to be careful. You know, we wanted to be respectful. And so it was a kind of a built-in caution that apparently was unnecessary, but we did get lucky.
We also we really see that project as like maybe a much smaller scale experiment in what could be a really fruitful and interesting engagement with the local community in those areas, right? If you could imagine that being scaled up 100 times, right, over the course of this so-called, wasteland, and actually allowing that to be kind of a participatory process with these inhabitants or these kind of informal users of these spaces, and what sort of perception shift that might engender, right? Within the other local communities who maybe regard that space as a kind of ecological disaster, right? That's sort of what we're trying to kind of resist, is that there are these kind of much more nuanced narratives within these spaces if you care to kind of look at them.
So this is somewhere between kind of an urban guerrilla intervention, right? And a range of work. And so what was provoking this question for me is when you said, we'd like to go back and see if they can again. We'd like to, but we're not sure we'll be able to. So what I'm wondering is if we take the seed balls and we take some of these, I remember in Holland you find flowers planted in potholes overnight, and they were called accidents because no one wanted to drive over the damn flower, right? It's like, oh my gosh, it was dangerous, right? But that was just somebody in a neighborhood doing something. It had not the thinking, the strategy. If you don't go back, if you don't have someone there to document this every season, then it's a beautiful urban guerrilla landscape intervention, and it's done. It's an art practice. You have photographed it. It's cool. With the strains, this is going at research that must be followed through, documented, etc., because the investment and the hope for it requires that type of continual proving, right? So how do you separate those two things in your practice? Because I think both are incredibly valid and meaningful, but how do you separate that? How do you just decide whether or not they're going to be these beautiful little interventions, or they're going to turn into these long, scale concerted research?
I mean, that's a good question. We're trying to answer that ourselves. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions lately about what kind of who we are, who we were, who we are, who we want to be. And, I think these more artistic interventions are really vital to us, to something very fundamental within us, where I think we have the heart of artists, we want to have impact in the world, but it's like we have to go out and we have to try some things and see if they work. And I think what we're realizing is sometimes it's a low stake, easy entrance into trying some things new that eventually do circle back. So this strains project, we didn't share it tonight, but we have 2 previous water projects that were done about 10 years ago that really did come back and inform this project and our thinking and our approach for this. It just took a while. And, getting more resources, learning more skills and tools, meeting more people, just what we had access to, it changes, and then you kind of take those opportunities as they come.
I think what I would say is what you're addressing is a very common critique of this current project of so-called tactical urbanism, right?
But that's tactical.
Right, so
Guerrilla,
right.
Tactical.
Which is that what are we really doing? A tactic is fine, but if you're not actually kind of tracing and measuring the reverberations of that or deploying them in a strategic way, there's really no point doing them. So I think there's a point doing them, but for us, the kind of strains approach emerged from a kind of frustration in our own practice of we have these ideas, but what is it? We have the tactics, but without the strategy, right? And really a desire, in a best case scenario, in a perfect world, those things would be collapsed into a kind of singular meta research project that we're actually operating on very small scales, but we're actually measuring the ripples over time. And I think we're getting closer to being able to do that, but it also requires a huge investment of time and resources.
I see the red line. I think you are too. It was because of the point you made that we may or may not go back. That's the one.
Yeah.
If you had said we won't go back, but we're hoping someone will send us photographs, that would have been a different answer. But there was this vacillation.
Yeah.
And that's why you opened it.
Totally. And this is something that relates to the work that we've actually collaborated on with Farad and Olivia. We're doing these things and we're sort of conceptualizing their development over, multi-decades or multi-centuries. But, not really having a very well-defined methodology for understanding those things and documenting those things.
Life is also messy, and we like, I think, we start these projects when we're 28 and we're like, of course we're gonna be able to come back in a year. Why wouldn't we be able? Of course we're gonna like,
Come back to every year.
yeah, like every single year we'll
Put the
document it.
agenda now.
I know, we're like, we'd love to, but, one reason or another, sometimes it's hard.
Yeah, so my question is, when you showed the last project, you were mentioning that you contacted also the local decision maker. So I would like to know whether, like, who is the local decision maker? Is it the administrators? Have you also contacted the local people about their views? Because I think the most difficult thing in India is it's easy to implement a project, but maintaining it, it's really hard. How do you change the mentality of the people so that they don't treat it as the drain? They see it as a new way of life. So,
No, that's a great question, and I think, one we can have our our educated guesses about, but are gonna have to test some things as we move on, or move through the project. Partnerships were and are incredibly important, so, we didn't really get into it too much, but we're working with a lot of folks. We're working with Ashoka Trust, which is an environmental organization, nonprofit, who's helping us with all of the science and the monitoring of the project. And through them, we are in contact with various different lake organizations that are community-driven. Those folks are absolutely wonderful. I mean, they are incredibly grassroots and dedicated. They really hit the ground running. They know how the government works. They know how to get things through. They know how to get things paid for. And those are really the people who push these projects through, who walk to them every day, who make sure they're up and running, who call us if there is a problem, who talks to the local communities to get everyone on board. And through them, through both organizations, through both types of organizations, we actually talk to the city and propose this to the city and to local funding options. Do you have anything to add about that? It's a lot of folks and a lot of meetings, but it actually moved pretty quickly.
Yeah, and the reality, is she still here? Oh, okay. Yeah, the reality is, we have yet to implement a live strains intervention within an actual NALA, right? That's a huge step forward, but we're trying to build enough of a foundational groundwork of understanding what these things could be, that hopefully, the big thing is that it's an untested idea. Anyone in the kind of city bureaucracy doesn't really, it's very nervous about untested ideas, right? Even though that's exactly what needs to be done, we need to start to pilot a kind of variety of things and see if they work. But our goal is to, hopefully that, if we can kind of start small, demonstrate that it's viable on a very, very small scale local level, right? That it's not just something that people disregard or don't, that they actually can maintain them, et cetera. I think that's what we're hoping to do.
And right now, the model that we're trying to push through is that these large scale luxury developers are actually, they want something nice right in front of the building, and so we're like, well, if you do that, you should make a public amenity, and also if you take that on to pay for it and to make it nice, that you're responsible then for maintaining it for a certain amount of time. And we can test out that model, and then we kind of add like a guarantee by having a certain amount of money in our budget that if everything absolutely goes to hell, we have enough money to fix it. That's how we're kind of working with it right now. Your 11 project research study was really interesting to me, and I was wondering if there were other things you saw besides the relationship between the palm trees and the built structures around them. If there were other moments that you also noticed that were also really interesting in similar ways.
Yeah.
Also, one other question in relation to the 11 palms as well is, do you know if it was because of any regulations that they couldn't cut these trees down, Or was it like a more of a community understanding of wanting to keep the plants and the landscape around them more intact while they build?
That's a great question. As far as we know, there aren't any specific building regulations that stipulate that you have to, if there's a productive coconut palm on a property that is to be developed, that you have to kind of maintain its placement. As far as we know, it is just a kind of phenomenon that happens, right? In the same way, it's considered extremely unlucky and auspicious to cut down a productive coconut palm. So most people, if they're not everyone, but many building owners or people who are building buildings will just opt to let them stay and build buildings around them, right? And what was interesting to us about that phenomena is that it goes against this narrative of loss, right? If we were to look at that street in a GIS map, it would just be an impervious surface, right? It probably wouldn't show the tree. But yet there's these little things, if you kind of get down into the city and you look at these issues obliquely from a kind of human perspective, you can see there's all these other much more interesting nuanced stories happening. And the same thing happens with, like, for example, anthills, right? In the city, you see this kind of cherished status of anthills.
They're beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you know what we're talking about?
Have you seen this? Okay.
They're like above ground. They're incredibly sculptural. They're usually a couple of feet. They're like almost like little ant monuments. They're incredibly beautiful and organic.
Yeah. And as far as we know, there has been a few really interesting precedents where entire mall developments have been shifted over 3 feet to the left to accommodate a single anthill. It's beautiful.
I have a question. I'm a landscape architect, and there are quite a few students from landscape architecture department. But I was trying to contextualize your work, because in some way it kind of resonated as something familiar. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering how you distinguish yourself from, not necessarily landscape architecture, but from 4 decades of environmental art, starting with, the earthworks. I mean, Ellen Sonfix, right? I mean, this reminds me of his time landscape, right? And then environmental art artists and land artists and ecological artists in the 80s and 90s and on and more recently. And I'm not, how do you see yourself doing things similar or different? Because I'm a little bit confused.
I mean, we're incredibly influenced by them. I mean, I think between the two of us, you can tell, like, we have a range of interests that we share under our studio, and that's why it can be hard to place them down. Like for myself personally, like I have an undergrad degree in product design, but then went into social design, public interest design, and then kind of got pulled into landscape and urbanism, and then now I'm now more invested in visual arts. So it's a windy road. But the Harrisons especially have been their practice has been incredibly influential. And I mean, like anything, we are looking heavily at their work and how they're dealing with sites, how they're dealing with materials, how they're talking about work, how they're talking about habitus and cultural norms. And trying to...
They're also engaging with mapping, right? The Harrison Studio. So I think, it's hopefully a continuum of land-engaged practice that is very much alive and strong today.
Yeah. But how's it? Maybe the process. Yeah. You are introducing something new. That's distinguishing.
I would say, I mean, we do care ultimately, I think the designers and us ultimately do care about this, I'm going to use the word, but I think it's the idea of impact, of that you're doing something with intention, that's intentionally shaping something, that's shaping place and space. And you're intervening in a way that's not necessarily like kind of encouraging something that would happen anyway, but encouraging something that would never happen otherwise. You know, how do you kind of be intentional with the creative role in some of these things? And I think that's kind of not like the critique or some of the things we're noticing in our early work, right? Which is like, yeah, we're maybe connecting one patch of green space to another, but that ultimately would have happened anyway. It just would have taken a really long time. What can we, you know, with this project, we were really focusing on, well, what would never happen without intervention? Marigolds to this degree would never have just found themselves in that site. And so what are the ramifications and the potentials and opportunities of that?
Also, I guess one of the other ways that we differentiate is like bringing to bear very contemporary methodologies from landscape architecture, right? And its ability to sort of conceptualize and understand these multiple scales of urbanization and of the city, right? In a way that I think a lot of the earthwork artists were not really engaging with. So it's kind of a 21st century approach that is really trying to quantify the impact of these things and trying to develop these things in much more strategic ways.
Just making comments as a collaborator in the previous project, right? I think that I found that our shared approach back in, this is now 4 years ago, 5 years ago, in Rome, where actually our project was very much developed in the research that we were doing into active reforestation that was happening without us, right, in Rome. And then that project, we were trying to find a way where we could actually not have to be going back and dealing with things because we were living in the community there and dealing with what we actually had available to us. And so to me, that, like thinking about seeing where you're going now, years later, and taking some of those foundations and where the research, whether it comes before how you're able to maybe continue on working in India, actually with increased resources and larger social networks, but also then maintaining some of these practices where nature comes in and loses some traces. I love seeing marigolds coming up again. It makes me wonder actually how much longer, like, is that going to be happening again in a year, 2 years, 3 years? Or is it going to get decimated because of the nature of this place? So anyways, Deborah, I got your question. I was just thinking back to what we did together, and the way that was very much down in looking at a landscape, right, that is happening already in the
Yeah, and I also wonder if we should maybe kind of contextualize that project at some point throughout the next few days for our students. We chose not to talk about it tonight, but it seems perhaps even more relevant to a lot of the deep paving. It's kind of come full circle, right, to this deep paving idea of like, what can we do to the ground plane to kind of engender these different types of ecologies.
I just wonder if you could perhaps say a bit more about the peculiar temporality of the conditions you're looking at here. In that, if we were to look at the commons in a more traditional sense, the commons is what is kind of always under threat. It's a kind of residue that then gets threatened by capitalist urban development. What you've got here, you kind of hostage to people talking about this because it's the last slide, I guess, but it's useful as well, is something which has kind of emerged quite quickly, and then will have a limited lifespan because this space will presumably be developed. And say it's interesting to me because then one is also thinking about the establishment of a kind of common space, but also knowing that what's its longevity, it's limited, its kind of emergence is kind of spontaneous and is inevitable. So I just wonder what, if you could kind of say a bit more about working with those particular conditions.
I mean, I think that's a good question. Like, I think there's something that we've been pondering about static, static versus evolving sites, and how do you handle that, and kind of personal responsibility. You know, when some of the first long-term initiatives that we had, we were very young, we were like in our early 20s, and we were like, we're going to do this forever. And then like 4 years later, we're like, we don't want to do this forever. And then, you know, we had to kind of like figure out an exit. And so we realized that that was not a sustainable way to work. So, you know, dealing with these sites, we kind of want to respect the fact that, you know, unless we're like going to move to Bangalore permanently and like advocate for that particular site to like, you know, be preserved, you know, that's probably not the best way of going about it. But we are hoping that these projects kind of can like be the first capstone in a larger conversation about the need for more public space. And we're hoping like that type of engagement, like that's what we can do. And we hope maybe influence other people who are there that are, you know, have a little bit of a heavier, longer term stake in it, in approaching it in new ways. And instead of, right, maybe coming in with more traditional ideas of what a public space should look like, could look like, they might be more experimental or be a little bit more, I don't know, maybe empowered by the fact that it would take less resources and less funding than maybe some traditional methods.
I think it's interesting as well that your reply, because there's distinction, a useful distinction, I think, to be made between the common and the public, because the creation of public space is often quite for people. It's designed for it. It's quite a passive relationship. You know, a park being designed for it. Whereas if you have this, even, it's just like micro scale where people in common producing space for themselves. So that signals a different possibility.
And the reality is they're doing it. I mean, when we went back this summer, you know, it's a really lovely place to be. It's people were playing. There were like 3 cricket games going on. A bunch of kids playing. You know, we met a bunch of folks just walking through. A couple people were having like a little lunch snack. You know, it's not really a destination for that neighborhood, but like in a place that just has very little outdoor public space. It's like a pleasure to be there.
I'm Asif. So I come from a town which has a Nala-based drainage infrastructure. So I have this 2 questions, like the human variable in the towns like that is very, they are the decisive factor really. So will there be any policy that will, you know, guide the people to use what you're making in certain ways that will sustain the project in the long run? Because without this kind of set policies, those tend to become kind of, as far as I know or I've seen, those tend to become kind of an experimental stuff which goes up to a certain point, and then the use, as it will be a new thing, the use will change itself, and the people will kind of find new uses for the whole project itself. And so will there be any kind of policies for that? And secondly, the nalas used to work for up to a certain time. The nalas worked well. It was quite very easy setup, very easy infrastructure, but it stopped to work in recent years. So if there comes a time when the target that you are setting, that the water purification and minimizing the pollution of water. If there comes a time when this also becomes, congested or becomes less useful than now, will there be any scope to, adapt that project up to further change so that you can, upscale the project in itself so that it can imbibe the change that the time has brought up?
Yeah, Kim's going to answer the second question first, and thank you for your question.
Well, this is something that we're really interested in, is like how can infrastructure change over time? This is completely hypothetical, but we come from LA and we've done some work with the LA River there and some of the surface water issues there as well. Our hypothesis or our thinking is that a system like this could grow with the city. So as these kind of more top-down systems, water systems come online, that this system, parts of the system will still be viable because you can always have cleaner surface water, things from the street, just stuff that gets washed in, which we think could be a really interesting component to play with. So that's what I have to say about it. We are thinking about it, but we just kind of have to give it a little more time. I'll let you answer the policy question.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you raised is a really relevant issue, and that is the fact that the existence of these NALA-based infrastructures are a kind of legacy of a much more democratic mode of, let's say, urban infrastructure maintenance, right? The reason that they're open air is that it allows people within the community to deal with issues as they arise, right? It's not just some buried infrastructure as we're used to in American or European cities that, is kind of under the purview of some municipal authority that needs to come out and with official machinery, et cetera. It's a much more democratic mode of infrastructural kind of development. So we are trying to sort of embrace that sense of the jugat, right? By kind of framing these things as provisional, as these things that we're kind of demonstrating the sort of base level functionality, but actually inviting that sense of community ownership, right? Of people saying, okay, this is how we can make this better, or this is how we can slightly modify it. And it really aligns with this model for critical upscaling that is ultimately aimed at the regime level actors or even the community level actors taking these things upon themselves, right? Rather than continuing to rely on resource inputs from us as the instigators of the idea. So we are hoping that kind of spontaneous diffusion through just making these things more transparent, making the process transparent, sharing information, right? Sharing information, whether or not it's, if we fail, we're going to share that publicly. If we have success, we're going to also share that. I think we're hoping that it can become something that adapts and evolves with the people who play.
Thank you.
Thank you all.